In the summer of 1872, in a remote farming community outside Ashford, Kentucky, an 8-year-old boy named Nathaniel Grayson became the subject of the most unsettling medical case study ever recorded in the American South. Dr. Elias Whitmore, the county's only practicing physician, chronicled his encounters with the child in 3 weathered, leather-bound journals, pages that would later be considered among the most chilling documents in 19th-century medicine. At first glance, Nathaniel appeared entirely ordinary. To neighbors and visiting relatives, he was polite, soft-spoken, and even endearing in the way children his age often were. His pale complexion and unusually light gray eyes gave him an almost angelic quality. But as Dr. Whitmore would soon observe, the boy's outward innocence concealed something that neither science nor scripture could explain. For 6 consecutive months, the farming community was plagued by strange tragedies. 3 people died in sudden, inexplicable accidents, each somehow connected to Nathaniel. Dozens of livestock, sheep, cattle, and horses, were found lifeless in their stalls and fields, their bodies bearing no visible wounds. And there were 11 others, all of whom, in one way or another, had crossed paths with Nathaniel Grayson. Their stories ended in injury, madness, or unexplained disappearance. The local sheriff and county officials quietly documented these events, then sealed the reports away, ensuring they would never reach public record. For over a century, the truth was buried in silence, whispered only in half-remembered folklore. Yet the story of Nathaniel Grayson, and the shadow that fell over Ashford County, endures as a chilling reminder that evil does not always wear the face of a grown man. Sometimes, it comes in the shape of a child, one whose smile never quite reaches his cold, pale eyes. Before we continue with this investigation into the life of Nathaniel Grayson and the terror he unleashed upon Ashford, if this story unsettles you, consider subscribing to our channel and tapping the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss our deep dives into America's most forgotten and darkest historical mysteries. And as always, let us know in the comments. What city or state are you listening from tonight? Ghost. Nathaniel Grayson was born in the late autumn of 1864, the second child of Thomas and Margaret Grayson, a hard-working farming family who owned nearly 40 acres of land outside Ashford, Kentucky. By all outward appearances, Nathaniel's upbringing was unremarkable. His father was known as a stern but fair man, while his mother carried a reputation for kindness and quiet strength. They attended the small wooden church that stood at the center of the county, and neighbors often saw the family riding into town in their horse-drawn wagon on Sundays. Unlike his older sister, Clara, who was bright and sociable, Nathaniel was a quieter child. He rarely joined the other boys in games of tag or marbles, and when he did, his manner was strangely detached, as though he were merely observing rather than truly playing. Some parents whispered that there was something off about him, though no one could say exactly what. His teachers described him as clever, though prone to staring off into space for unnerving stretches of time. His pale gray eyes fixed on something invisible that no one else could see. Physically, Nathaniel was fragile-looking. His skin was unusually pale, almost translucent in certain lights, and his hair, a thin shade of blonde, gave him the appearance of being delicate, angelic, even. To strangers, he was polite and well-mannered, always ready with a small bow or a quiet "yes, sir." But those who spent more time with him noticed something chilling. His smiles, though frequent, never touched his eyes. They remained cold and distant, like the eyes of a much older man. One peculiar habit set him further apart from other children. He had a way of appearing suddenly, standing silently in doorways behind fences or at the edge of fields, watching without saying a word. Several neighbors complained that they had seen Nathaniel staring at them from the road late at night, though when asked, the Graysons insisted he had been in bed the entire time. Clara, his sister, was the first to express her unease openly. She confided to her mother that Nathaniel often whispered to himself in the dark, carrying conversations as though speaking to someone unseen. When pressed, Nathaniel would only smile faintly and insist he had been talking to the quiet man. The family brushed it off as an imaginary friend, a harmless quirk of childhood. But Dr. Whitmore, who had already begun observing the boy casually during house calls, would later note in his journals that Nathaniel's conversations seemed far too measured, too deliberate, to belong to the world of childish fancy. By the summer of 1872, Nathaniel was 8 years old, and the strange aura around him had only grown stronger. To most, he was simply a shy, unusual boy. But to those who had begun noticing the subtle disturbances that followed in his wake, Nathaniel Grayson was something else entirely. A puzzle no one in Ashford could solve, but one that would soon unravel in the most terrifying way imaginable. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The first troubling signs in Ashford appeared not among its people, but among its animals. It began quietly, almost insignificantly, in the early weeks of that sweltering summer of 1872. Farmers woke to find chickens lying lifeless in their coops, their bodies stiff but without a single mark to explain their sudden deaths. At first, the farmers blamed foxes or snakes, but no bite marks were ever found, and the coops themselves showed no sign of intrusion. Soon after, larger animals began to perish. A pair of calves belonging to the Miller family were discovered one morning stretched out in the pasture, eyes wide open as though frozen in terror. When Thomas Miller examined them, he found no wounds, no sickness, no reason for their sudden demise. The veterinarian summoned from a nearby county offered no answers. Perfectly healthy yesterday, Miller told the neighbors. Stone dead today. Whispers spread across the community, but no one connected the incidents until the deaths grew more frequent. Within a month, several families reported losing livestock in the same baffling manner. Horses collapsed in their stalls. Goats were found cold and lifeless in the fields. Even hunting dogs, animals known for their strength and resilience, were discovered dead beside their chains. The pattern was always the same: no struggle, no wounds, no explanation. It was during this time that Nathaniel Grayson's name began to surface in hushed conversations. On more than one occasion, neighbors reported seeing the boy lingering near the very barns and pastures where the deaths occurred. He was often spotted standing at fence lines, silent and motionless, his pale gray eyes fixed on the animals as though he were waiting for something. One evening, Sarah Collins, a widow who lived on the edge of town, claimed she saw Nathaniel standing in her yard just after dusk. "He was looking straight at my chickens," she later told her sister. "Didn't say a word, didn't move, just stared. And when I called out, he smiled and walked away. The next morning, half my flock was gone. Dead. Every one of them." When word of these accounts reached Dr. Elias Whitmore, he grew uneasy. As Ashford's only physician, he had a scientific mind, trained to dismiss superstition. Yet he could not ignore the growing pattern. He began to take notes whenever the Grayson family called for his services, quietly documenting Nathaniel's mannerisms and the strange reports that always seemed to follow him. In his journal, he wrote a line that would later chill historians. "The boy does not touch the animals, nor does he seem to harm them. And yet, wherever he lingers, death follows." By the end of that summer, the farmers of Ashford were not only losing livestock, they were losing sleep. Doors were bolted at night, and lanterns burned longer than usual. Though no one dared accuse an 8-year-old child openly, many in the community had already begun to suspect that Nathaniel Grayson's presence was more curse than coincidence. And soon, the deaths would no longer be confined to the fields and barns. Ghost. By late July of 1872, the farming community of Ashford had grown restless. The string of unexplained livestock deaths weighed heavily on families whose survival depended on their animals. People spoke of ruined harvests and empty winters, and while some clung to practical explanations, disease, predators, bad luck, others began lowering their voices and asking the same dangerous question: what about the Grayson boy? At church gatherings, the whispers grew. Mothers would draw their children closer when Nathaniel entered, his pale eyes wandering the wooden pews with detached curiosity. Fathers exchanged uneasy glances, pretending not to notice how often the boy seemed to sit alone, never singing the hymns, only staring silently at the altar. The Collins family, still shaken after the sudden loss of their chickens, were the first to speak plainly. "That child," Sarah Collins muttered one Sunday after service. "Ain't right. Mark my words. Trouble follows him like a shadow." Her words spread quickly, carried from one household to another, until even the most skeptical farmers found themselves recounting strange encounters with Nathaniel. One man claimed the boy had stood outside his barn just hours before two of his horses were found dead. Another insisted Nathaniel had appeared in his orchard, silent as ever, the night before his hounds were discovered lifeless. The pattern was too strong, the coincidences too sharp. And then there were the nighttime stories. Several neighbors swore they had seen Nathaniel walking the dirt roads alone after midnight, though his parents believed him to be asleep. One farmer, Thomas Reed, recalled waking to the sound of soft humming outside his window. When he pulled back the curtain, he saw the boy standing in the moonlight, his lips moving faintly as though in song. By morning, Reed's prized milk cow was dead. These accounts might have been dismissed as superstition, had they not been so consistent. The fear spread like infection, unspoken but ever-present. Even children felt it. Nathaniel's schoolmates avoided him during lessons, refusing to sit beside him or share their lunches. One little girl told her mother that when Nathaniel looked at her, she felt cold inside, like winter had come early. The Grayson family, for their part, seemed unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to the storm of suspicion gathering around their son. Thomas Grayson defended the boy fiercely, brushing off gossip as rural ignorance. Margaret, though quieter, looked increasingly troubled, often keeping Nathaniel close to her side as though shielding him from unseen judgment. But no amount of parental protection could silence the growing unrest. In kitchens and barns, behind closed doors, the neighbors of Ashford whispered a name they dared not say too loudly: witchcraft. Some believed Nathaniel cursed, others believed him possessed. But whatever the explanation, one thing was certain: death followed wherever he went. And soon, it would no longer be just animals the town had to mourn. 4. The summer heat bore down heavily on Ashford in August of 1872, turning the fields into a haze of dust and sweat. Farmers rose before dawn and worked long after sunset, their lanterns flickering against the backdrop of darkened hills. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of rural life, fear was growing like a fever. The livestock deaths had shaken the town, but people told themselves, sometimes desperately, that animals were one thing. Human lives, surely, were another matter entirely. That illusion shattered on the morning of August 14th. The victim was Elias Turner, a 36-year-old farmhand known for his booming laugh and fondness for drink. Turner lived alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of Ashford, working odd jobs for local farmers. He was not a man easily rattled, though he was among the loudest in accusing the Grayson boy of being unnatural. Several witnesses recalled him mocking Nathaniel openly at the general store just a week earlier, calling him the little ghoul. On that August morning, Turner's body was discovered by a neighbor, sprawled in the dirt path outside his cabin. His expression was frozen in a rictus of terror, eyes wide, mouth gaping as though he had died mid-scream. There were no wounds on his body, no signs of a struggle. His heart had simply stopped. When Sheriff Alcott examined the scene, he found something that chilled even his seasoned nerves. According to his report, later sealed and hidden away, small footprints were visible in the dust near the cabin. Children's footprints. They led directly to Turner's door, then back into the woods. That same morning, a local woman claimed to have seen Nathaniel Grayson wandering along the tree line near Turner's cabin. He was just standing there, she later testified to her sister, like he'd been waiting for something. The community's reaction was swift and divided. Some insisted Turner's death was the result of drink or poor health, but others, already primed by months of whispered suspicions, saw it as undeniable proof. The boy had brought death to one of their own. Dr. Elias Whitmore conducted a discreet examination of the body. His findings, recorded in his journal, raised more questions than answers. No evidence of poison, no wounds, no trauma of any kind. The expression upon the face is most unnatural, as though the man glimpsed some unspeakable horror at the moment of death. This I cannot explain. After Turner's funeral, A heavy silence settled over Ashford. Neighbors no longer whispered their fears. They spoke them openly. Mothers forbade their children from going near the Grayson boy. Farmers crossed themselves when he passed. Even the pastor, who urged his congregation not to succumb to superstition, admitted in private that something about the child unsettled him deeply. Nathaniel himself remained unchanged. When asked about Turner's death, he simply shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He shouldn't have said those things," he whispered once, so softly that only Clara, his sister, claimed to have heard him. From that day forward, the town understood that what was happening in Ashford was no longer confined to barns and fields. Whatever shadow clung to Nathaniel Grayson had claimed its first human life, and it would not be the last. By the time Elias Turner was buried, Dr. Elias Whitmore had already filled nearly one leather-bound journal with scattered notes, fragments of observations, and uneasy reflections on the strange child at the heart of Ashford's unrest. As a physician, Whitmore had been trained to believe in reason above all else. Disease, contagion, and the frailty of the human body explained most tragedies. Yet, as the weeks passed, he found himself writing things that made his own hand tremble. His earliest entries were almost clinical. He noted Nathaniel's pallor, his unusual silence during examinations, and the way his pulse seemed slower than it should have been for a boy his age. Whitmore recorded that Nathaniel rarely blinked and had an uncanny ability to remain motionless for long stretches, as though suspended outside the natural rhythm of childhood. But after Turner's death, the tone of his journal darkened. One passage read, "The matter of young Grayson troubles me greatly. When I look into his eyes, I sense not illness, but an absence, an emptiness which medical science cannot quantify. It is as though he is a vessel, waiting to be filled by something unseen." Another entry, written in hurried script, described a night when Whitmore passed the Grayson property and saw Nathaniel standing in the yard long after midnight. The boy's face was tilted toward the sky, his lips moving as though in silent prayer or conversation. "The family lanterns were extinguished," Whitmore wrote. "Yet he stood there alone. I called his name. He turned and smiled, but there was no recognition in that smile, only a hollow mockery of human warmth." As reports of more dead animals and unexplained accidents arrived, Whitmore's journals shifted from observation to near confession. He admitted his growing fear that Nathaniel was not merely unusual, but dangerous in a way medicine could not diagnose. One of the most haunting entries came just weeks after Turner's passing. "I must record this, though it may brand me a fool. The boy came to my office unannounced. He did not knock, did not speak at first, only stood in the doorway watching. When I asked why he had come, he said, in a voice too calm for his years, "You write about me. You should stop." My blood ran cold. He smiled then, the same lifeless smile. I could not summon words. He turned and left as silently as he had arrived. I do not believe he walked away. I believe he simply was gone. By autumn, Dr. Whitmore's journals contained more than medical detail. They were becoming a record of dread, the testimony of a man torn between his duty as a physician and his terror as a human being. "If this child is but a child, then I am unfit to practice medicine. But if he is not," the entry trailed off, unfinished, as though the doctor himself could not bear to complete the thought. Ghost. *WHI. By the early weeks of September 1872, the fear in Ashford had hardened into something darker. Certainty. What had begun as whispers among neighbors had become open conviction. Wherever Nathaniel Grayson walked, misfortune followed. The second death came quietly. Martha Green, a young mother of two, collapsed suddenly while drawing water from her well. Her neighbors rushed to her side but found her already gone. Her body limp, her face bearing the same expression of frozen terror that had marked Elias Turner. There were no signs of sickness, no warning. She had been laughing with a neighbor not an hour earlier. When her husband arrived home to find Nathaniel lingering near the edge of their property, silent as ever, the man broke down in grief and rage. He shouted accusations, swearing the boy had cursed his family. Though others tried to calm him, the damage was done. The town's doubts had transformed into open belief. Soon after, tragedy struck again. A schoolteacher, Mr. Alfred Byrne, was found dead at his desk after evening lessons. His ink bottle spilled, his hand still gripping the quill, his body frozen as if mid-breath. Several students swore that moments before, Nathaniel had been standing outside the window watching the class. That autumn, the deaths and accidents seemed endless. A farmer fell beneath his plow. A young girl nearly drowned in the creek, only to claim later that Nathaniel had been waiting on the bank. Horses spooked at nothing, wagons overturned on calm roads, fires started without cause in kitchens that had been cold for hours. Every calamity, no matter how small, was tied in someone's mind to the Grayson boy. The fear seeped into daily life. Families began locking their doors before sundown. Farmers no longer lingered in the fields. Even the pastor's sermons shifted, dwelling heavily on scripture about evil in unexpected forms. He never named Nathaniel outright, but everyone knew the implication. Children were forbidden from playing near the Grayson property. Some claimed they heard knocking on their windows at night, followed by faint laughter. Others swore Nathaniel appeared in their dreams, standing at the foot of their beds with that same lifeless smile. For the first time, even Thomas and Margaret Grayson, Nathaniel's own parents, could not ignore what was happening. Thomas grew withdrawn, refusing to answer questions at church or in town. Margaret, pale and weary, kept Nathaniel at her side constantly, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, though her eyes betrayed something closer to fear than love. Dr. Whitmore, meanwhile, recorded grimly in his journal, "The people of Ashford now speak of the boy not as a curiosity, but as a curse. I find myself agreeing with them in secret, though my reason protests. Death gathers about him as smoke gathers around fire, and I fear the flame has only just begun to burn." By the harvest season, Ashford was no longer the same quiet farming town it had been. Fear had rooted itself deep in the soil, choking every aspect of life. And at the center of it all stood Nathaniel Grayson, an 8-year-old child whose very presence seemed to unravel the fragile order of the community. The people began to wonder not if, but when the next life would be taken. By the end of 1872, Ashford was a town suffocating under its own fear. 3 human lives had been claimed, countless animals had perished, and the very fabric of the community seemed to unravel. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. Families left food rotting in the fields rather than risk venturing out, and every whispered prayer in the wooden church seemed tinged with desperation. At the center of it all remained one child, Nathaniel Grayson. It was around this time that the county officials stepped in. Sheriff Alcott, along with a small council of elders and the local pastor, met in secret behind the closed doors of the Ashford courthouse. What was said in that room was never publicly recorded, but scraps of testimony preserved decades later suggest a grim consensus. The truth had to be contained, buried before it consumed the town entirely. The sheriff's deputies began gathering statements from witnesses, accounts of livestock found dead, of accidents too strange to explain, of Nathaniel's eerie presence at the edges of so many tragedies. But instead of being added to the county's archives, these reports vanished. Entire ledgers disappeared from the sheriff's office. Journals, including the earliest pages of Dr. Whitmore's notes, were confiscated under the guise of preserving evidence. One clerk, years later, confessed to having seen the sealed box himself. It was locked tight, heavy with papers, marked only with the words "Grayson Matter." "They told me never to speak of it. Said it was best forgotten." The deaths, too, were officially rewritten. Elias Turner's heart attack, Martha Green's sudden fever, Alfred Byrne's natural causes. None of the county records mentioned Nathaniel by name. His shadow had been erased from the pages of history even as it still hung over Ashford like a storm cloud. Some families protested. Sarah Collins, widowed and bitter, begged the officials to do something about the boy. Others whispered of taking matters into their own hands. But the council had made its decision. Silence was safer than truth. To accuse a child openly, they reasoned, would invite scandal, hysteria, perhaps even violence. Better to bury the story. Better to let Nathaniel fade into obscurity. But Nathaniel did not fade. He continued to walk the dirt roads, silent and smiling, as though untouched by the chaos surrounding him. His parents withdrew from public life, rarely leaving their farm. Clara, his sister, grew thin and pale, her once bright laughter reduced to silence. Dr. Whitmore, perhaps the only man who dared document the reality, wrote with despair in his final autumn entry, "The officials have ordered silence, but I cannot remain silent in my own soul. If these records are sealed, it is not because they protect the boy. It is because they protect the world from knowing him. Nathaniel Grayson is no ordinary child. He is a wound in the fabric of nature, and the more they attempt to hide him, the deeper that wound becomes." The records were locked away, hidden in the courthouse cellar, never to be mentioned in public again. And so Ashford entered the winter of 1872 with its terror unspoken, its truth buried beneath silence. But evil does not vanish with ink, nor can it be hidden behind sealed doors. Nathaniel remained, and his cold smile endured, haunting the town long after the last page was locked away. Ghost, Part 9, The Sealed Records. By the end of 1872, Ashford was a town suffocating under its own fear. 3 human lives had been claimed, countless animals had perished, and the very fabric of the community seemed to unravel. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. Families left food rotting in the fields rather than risk venturing out, and every whispered prayer in the wooden church seemed tinged with desperation. At the center of it all remained one child, Nathaniel Grayson. It was around this time that the county officials stepped in. Sheriff Alcott, along with a small council of elders and the local pastor, met in secret behind the closed doors of the Ashford courthouse. What was said in that room was never publicly recorded, but scraps of testimony preserved decades later suggest a grim consensus. The truth had to be contained, buried before it consumed the town entirely. The sheriff's deputies began gathering statements from witnesses, accounts of livestock found dead, of accidents too strange to explain, of Nathaniel's eerie presence at the edges of so many tragedies. But instead of being added to the county's archives, these reports vanished. Entire ledgers disappeared from the sheriff's office. Journals, including the earliest pages of Dr. Whitmore's notes, were confiscated under the guise of preserving evidence. One clerk, years later, confessed to having seen the sealed box himself. It was locked tight, heavy with papers, marked only with the words "Grayson Matter." "They told me never to speak of it. Said it was best forgotten." The deaths, too, were officially rewritten. Elias Turner's heart attack, Martha Green's sudden fever, Alfred Burns' natural causes. None of the county records mentioned Nathaniel by name. His shadow had been erased from the pages of history even as it still hung over Ashford like a storm cloud. Some families protested. Sarah Collins, widowed and bitter, begged the officials to do something about the boy. Others whispered of taking matters into their own hands. But the council had made its decision. Silence was safer than truth. To accuse a child openly, they reasoned, would invite scandal, hysteria, perhaps even violence. Better to bury the story. Better to let Nathaniel fade into obscurity. But Nathaniel did not fade. He continued to walk the dirt roads, silent and smiling, as though untouched by the chaos surrounding him. His parents withdrew from public life, rarely leaving their farm. Clara, his sister, grew thin and pale, her once bright laughter reduced to silence. Dr. Whitmore, perhaps the only man who dared document the reality, wrote with despair in his final autumn entry, "The officials have ordered silence, but I cannot remain silent in my own soul. If these records are sealed, it is not because they protect the boy. It is because they protect the world from knowing him. Nathaniel Grayson is no ordinary child. He is a wound in the fabric of nature, and the more they attempt to hide him, the deeper that wound becomes." The records were locked away, hidden in the courthouse cellar, never to be mentioned in public again. And so Ashford entered the winter of 1872 with its terror unspoken, its truth buried beneath silence. But evil does not vanish with ink, nor can it be hidden behind sealed doors. Nathaniel remained, and his cold smile endured, haunting the town long after the last page was locked away. Ghost, Part 9, The Sealed Records. The courthouse cellar in Ashford, Massachusetts, was nothing more than a damp stone chamber. Long forgotten by the turn of the 20th century, the town had grown modestly, its wooden barns replaced with brick, its dirt roads paved with gravel, and the terrible winter of 1872 remembered only in fading family whispers. Most residents dismissed the darker tales of the Grayson boy as superstition, stories told to frighten children into obedience. But the truth was not gone. It merely slept. In 1974, nearly 102 years after Nathaniel Grayson's shadow had fallen over the farming community, a group of county archivists began a project to reorganize historical documents. They were tasked with cataloging the oldest files stored beneath the courthouse. Most of it was mundane land deeds, marriage certificates, weather logs. But buried beneath a stack of cracked leather-bound ledgers, archivist Ellen Price uncovered a sealed box, its iron latch rusted shut. On its face, in fading ink, was a single phrase, "Grayson Matter. Curiosity overrode protocol." Ellen pried the box open and, for the first time in over a century, the silence imposed by Ashford's leaders was broken. Inside lay hundreds of yellowed pages. Witness testimonies, death records, and most chilling of all, the surviving journals of Dr. Jonathan Whitmore. The archivists were stunned. The accounts inside described livestock dying without wounds, neighbors claiming to see Nathaniel wandering by moonlight, accidents that seemed less accidental the more they were examined. Dr. Whitmore's handwriting, increasingly frantic toward the final pages, spoke of a child whose very presence warped the natural order. Asterisk, he is not evil in the way of men. He is evil in the way of storms, unthinking, inevitable, without mercy. Nathaniel smiles, and death answers. Asterisk, the discovery should have remained academic, a curiosity for historians. But it did not. Within weeks of the records being unsealed, odd occurrences began around Ashford once more. Livestock deaths, this time at modern farms on the outskirts of town. Reports of strange, humming outside windows at night. One woman swore she saw a boy in outdated 19th century clothing standing in her yard at dawn, his eyes pale and unblinking. The county tried to dismiss the stories as hysteria, insisting that the release of the journals had simply fueled imaginations. But older families, those whose great-grandparents had lived through 1872, knew better. They had heard the whispers as children, the warnings never written but passed down in secret. Asterisk, do not speak his name aloud. Do not follow him if you see him in the dark. Asterisk. By 1975, Ashford's newspaper ran a quiet editorial suggesting the town reconsider housing the Grayson files. It was phrased diplomatically, but the intent was clear. People were afraid. The box was eventually transferred to the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, far from the soil that had once borne Nathaniel Grayson. The archivists, relieved to see it go, hoped the strange events would cease. But the terror followed. Researchers who handled the files in Boston reported disturbing dreams. Visions of a boy with a fixed smile, standing silently at the foot of their beds. One archivist, a young man named Daniel Fletcher, claimed he woke one night to the sound of faint humming outside his apartment. When he looked through the window, he saw nothing. But in the morning, his cat was dead, its body cold and stiff as though it had been lying in the snow, though it was midsummer. The journals were moved again, this time into restricted storage. Access required special permission, and most scholars avoided them altogether. Yet the story of Nathaniel Grayson leaked into academic circles, whispered at conferences, and passed between folklore enthusiasts. And then came the most disturbing revelation. In 1981, a genealogist traced records that suggested the Grayson family line had not ended in the 19th century as many assumed. Clara, Nathaniel's younger sister, had survived into adulthood and married quietly under a different name. Her descendants, scattered across New England, lived ordinary lives, or so it seemed. But among those descendants were repeated patterns. unexplained deaths of pets, neighbors who moved away citing unease, children described by teachers as strange or distant. Nothing ever proven, nothing that could be written as fact. But enough to suggest that the shadow of Nathaniel had not only survived, it had multiplied. Even today, in the quiet corners of Ashford, some say that when the moon is thin and the night is silent, you can hear soft humming in the fields. Some claim a pale-eyed boy, no older than 8, still walks the dirt roads though generations have passed. Others whisper that he never truly died at all, that whatever Nathaniel was, it could not be buried, sealed, or forgotten. The last words of Dr. Whitmore's journal seem almost prophetic when read now, more than a century after he wrote them. Asterisk, the council believes silence is protection. They are wrong. Silence is permission. And with every year they deny his existence, the boy grows stronger. He is not bound to time. He will wait, and when we forget him, he will return. Asterisk. Those words have echoed through the decades, haunting anyone who dares to read them. And so the tale of Nathaniel Grayson does not end in 1872, nor in 1974, nor even now. It lingers, an unfinished shadow stretching across generations. A reminder that some darkness cannot be reasoned with, cannot be explained, and cannot be contained by human hands. If you ever find yourself near Ashford, Massachusetts, and you hear humming carried on the wind, do not look outside. Do not follow the sound. For some say the boy is still waiting, his smile never reaching his eyes, his presence as cold as the grave. And if history has taught us anything, it is this: evil never truly dies. It only waits,